The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 16th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do, now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Gospel of the Lord. So earlier this week at our council meeting, we were reviewing some of our policies on doing background checks. As many of you know, we background check all of our staff and anybody who works directly with children. And I say that many of you know this because many of you have been background checked by us, because you work with kids. And we do this not because we somehow inherently don't trust you. It's because we know that in our lives and in our world, there are people like this guy in the gospel reading from which Jesus tells this parable today. In fact, it's sort of a shame that there weren't background checks in the first century, or maybe this boss would have known that the guy he had hired as his manager was a crook. Because it's clear that he's a crook. Not only has he been apparently skimming off the top and he gets caught, but even after he gets caught, he continues to cook the books. He calls people in and has them sit down and change their bills. And the thing is, you would expect Jesus to use a more likable, nice guy as an example in a parable. Or at least somebody who kind of had a tragic flaw, something that we could identify with. But there's nothing like that in this particular individual. He knows he's guilty. He goes on being guilty for as long as he can get away with it. And then Jesus does something that's really weird. There's a twist in this story. The owner, the boss of the company, did you notice this? The boss commends the dishonest manager. He actually says, "This is really good about this crook." It's weird. I go, really? And what's good, or what's commendable about this guy, is not his dishonesty. It's not his way of cooking the books. Rather, the owner of the company says, "Hey, this guy's shrewd." And Jesus says, that's the point of this parable. This guy is commended for his shrewdness. Now, the word shrewd in English doesn't always have positive connotations. It's sort of a weird word that we don't use very often. And so I was looking this up in the actual Greek that Luke used. And the word actually simply means wise or prudent. And it's translated like that almost every place else. So when Jesus says to his disciples, "Be wise as serpents," that's the word. It's the same word that's translated here as shrewd. And it's a little bit different here because the connotations of the word mean that the shrewdness for which this manager is being commended is about being emotionally ready and willing to accept a new reality. It's not just about being smart, but this guy is brought in and told, you're losing your job. It's gone. And he jumps over all 5 stages of grief just like that. He goes right to acceptance. There's no denial, there's no anger, there's none of this kind of stuff. All right, this is where we are, and he's ready to move. He's emotionally accepted it. He doesn't argue with it. And that's part of what makes him shrewd. And he's able to emotionally accept this new reality, even a reality that's really bad for him, that he doesn't like. And then, what makes him shrewd is that he's willing to be able to think through and think about possibilities that he has never thought about in his life. You know, a lot of times we get into a difficult situation, people tell us, well, you got to think outside the box. This guy not only thinks outside the box, he redraws the box. He figures out, here's what I can do. I'm too weak to dig, and I'm too embarrassed to beg. So those are the 2 possibilities that most people would think about in that kind of situation. So he completely reinvents his reality and says, here's what I'll do. I'll continue to cook the books. This is why when you get fired, somebody gets fired from a job like that, they don't let the person go back and work on stuff for a while because they figure they'll do stuff like this guy. But he has the opportunity and he says, I can figure out a way out of this. And for as dishonest as this is, he's willing to take decisive action. He doesn't just accept the reality and think through what some of his options might be. He's ready to act immediately and in the moment to make sure that he can live in to that new reality. So sometimes, and actually it really does happen quite a bit in this part of Luke's gospel, Jesus uses a character who is intended to kind of shake us up and say, wait a minute, that ain't right. What is this guy doing? He's using that particularly to get our attention to make a point. And the point is not that we should be dishonest or cook the books for our bosses or stuff like that. The point is Jesus saying, look, you know how dishonest people you should have done background checks on, are able to act shrewdly when they get caught. When there's a new reality in their life, they're able to emotionally accept it, think through it, and act immediately. They're able to do that. What about you when God is doing a new thing in your life? Because Jesus says that's what's happening right now for you. God is about bringing about a new day, a new reality, a new time in your life. And are you prepared also to be people who follow me by living shrewdly in the same way that this manager did, not in a dishonest sense, but being willing to accept and think through and act on this new time and this new reality that God has given you in your life? That's the kind of shrewdness that Jesus is calling us to. It's a shrewdness that calls us to accept the emotional reality that sometimes is difficult. I mean, this guy was getting fired from his job. That's never a fun place for any of us to be in. And a lot of the realities that we find ourselves in today are not fun realities. There are times when I simply do not want to open my news apps because there's more stuff to be scared about, to be disgusted about, to be depressed about, and honestly, I would rather go into my house, close the door, pull the sheets up over my head, and just go, I don't want to deal with this. Do you ever be in those kinds of situations where you go, I just can't deal with this. I don't want to. What the guy does in the parable is he doesn't stop and go, I just don't want to deal with this. He actually does. Because he can see somehow in accepting this uncomfortable reality that there might be opportunity there. And I try to remember when I am in those uncomfortable situations that I just don't like and don't want to deal with, that many times the greatest things that God does in people's lives in the Bible happen in the midst of really bad, uncomfortable situations. The disciples first experience resurrection and new life because they are willing to follow Jesus to the cross and to go and stand at the tomb. It's in the midst of death, destruction, the whole going away of what they thought life was going to be, that they start to experience this new reality in their lives. Sometimes for us, seeing and living into God's new reality means accepting the situation that we're living in, emotionally accepting it, and going, even when things are bad, even when things are scary, even when things are just chaotic beyond belief, those could be the places that God is doing something new in my life, that God is going to be offering me a different kind of opportunity. And that means for us too, the shrewdness that Jesus calls us to is about thinking through new possibilities and new ways of living into the future. Jesus called his disciples all the time to live in new ways, and everybody's great with, you gotta try something new until you actually gotta do something new. Somebody was asking me the other day, they said, why do we do this thing in church that we do? And I had to honestly say the first and most important reason that we do this in church is because we're Lutherans and we've always done it that way. Because that's what we do. And we get into doing things just the way we've done them. And sometimes that's the problem. But here's the other flip side to that sometimes not only do we need to think of a new way to do something, to live faithfully into the future, sometimes the way that we live faithfully in the future is to stop doing something that we've done before. Sometimes the most outrageous thing we can do is not to do this new wild thing that nobody's ever heard of, but to stop doing a very basic thing that we've always done. Because sometimes in the death of those things, we have the new life of, we have time, we have energy, we have bandwidth to put into a new place, a new possibility. That's always what Jesus was calling his first disciples to do, was to be able to say, sometimes you're hung up on the wrong things, and now it's time to shift and to think about trying something new. And to do that, sometimes you've got to stop the old stuff that you're doing. That's what this guy was willing to do in the parable. He's like, I'm not going to be the manager anymore, but maybe there's another possibility and another way here. And that's the kind of thing that Jesus is calling us to do. Not with the dishonest stuff that I'm going to have to go visit you in jail, but thinking about the new things and the new possibilities that God puts before you each day. And that means for us too, shrewdness is about being willing to act. Being willing to actually do something decisively and not get caught up just thinking about it and imagining what it might look like if we tried, but we don't really want to. And one of the things it's always been a kind of a gem of this parable for me is to notice the other phrase that's really difficult here is dishonest wealth. It appears several times. If you can use the dishonest wealth, and because it's translated as dishonest wealth, people sit there and go, oh yeah, money bad, God good, stuff, yeah. But here's the thing, that phrase actually just means transitory wealth, things that are passing away. What Jesus is actually calling people to do is to do what so many Christians will not do, which is they want to take their spiritual life and say, here's my spiritual life. It's about emotion and God and love and all kinds of stuff like that. And here's my real life. It's about going to work and paying the bills and going to vote and doing all that kind of stuff. And this is my real life. And I know that this stuff over here should affect this over here, but I really don't. I treat them as two separate things in my life. What Jesus is doing in this parable is pulling those two things together and says, the way you live into your spiritual life is by using the actual stuff and the actual opportunities in your real life that God gives you. Those are two sides of the same coin. They are not separate from one another. Your life is your life. And what Jesus is calling us to do is to be people who actually enact in our real lives what it is that's important to us in our spiritual lives. That's the kind of shrewdness that Jesus calls each of us to every day. Because the one thing Jesus says is always going to be certain is that God is doing new stuff in our lives. God is leading us into a future that is different than what we probably imagined it would be. And even when that future seems kind of scary and strange and chaotic, Jesus promises us that God has new opportunities for us and is calling us to live into that future. And that means that Jesus calls us always to be people who each day embrace hope and new life. He calls us to be people who are ready to consider and envision new possibilities, and to be people who act boldly, being willing to invest ourselves and our material possessions in the future to which God calls us each and every day.